Having been building PCs for a decade and a half now, I've seen my fair share of trends and myths about speccing and building gaming PCs. So I think it's time that I share some of my favourite hot takes when it comes to building PCs. You might disagree on some of these, possibly all of them, so feel free to let me know in the comments below, along with sharing your own hot takes for PC builders. Right, let's ruffle some feathers. First off, you should skimp on your first GPU in favour of buying a higher end CPU. Now, I know that this defies all conventional wisdom, and if we were just looking at that first iteration of the system in isolation, I would agree with you that that was complete madness. But you've got to look at the bigger picture. The vast majority of gamers who build their own systems are the sort of gamers who will end up upgrading their graphics card, but will often forego upgrading the CPU, eventually just retiring or repurposing the CPU, RAM and motherboard, and sometimes cooler, in favour of a full platform upgrade 5 or so years later. But in those 5 years, the GPU will likely change out at least once, if not twice. The purpose of essentially sacrificing some performance now for a better experience later might not be for everyone. But think of it like this. If you bought an i3 10100 in 2020 so that you could get a 2070 instead of a maybe 10400F or 10600K and a 2060, well, the 10100 is going to be a bigger bottleneck to a 4060 when you want to upgrade, say this year, compared to a 10600K. Now that isn't likely to be a huge sort of deal either way, at least in the grand scheme of things, but if you can eke out more performance in the long run from your system at the cost of a little bit of performance up front, isn't that a trade-off you'd prefer? Next up, you don't need an NVMe SSD. Now, this isn't necessarily an argument against NVMe drives. They have quite a few benefits that I'll explain in a second, but more a rally against the march of PCI Gen 4 and especially Gen 5 drives. As I found out in my recent video on the dirt cheap 8TB SSD that I'll link in the cards above if you're interested, definitely check that one out. SATA drives are still more than adequate, and in that case, it can be had for exceptionally cheap while getting an enterprise grade 8TB capacity drive, all for the price of a 2TB PCI Gen 5 drive. When direct storage finally turns up in games, yeah, something like a PCI Gen 4 drive might see a bit of a loading time benefit, maybe, but even being charitable and saying that the 30 total titles that SteamDB lists with direct storage support, which includes 3D Mark and a couple of demos and a closed beta, no less, it's clear that direct storage isn't exactly being rushed into the market. You've got time. With that said, getting a decent Gen 3 NVMe drive actually isn't a bad idea. The form factor of M.2 alone makes it an incredibly appealing option thanks to the complete lack of cables. You just slot the drive in and then screw it down or clip it down even, maybe put the heatsink back on, and hey presto, you've got a whole SSD built right onto your motherboard. That is well worth it, but you don't need to splash out on a Gen 3 or a Gen 4 or a Gen 5 drive anytime soon, at least if you don't want to. Next, air cooling is better than AIO liquid coolers. This one might need the most clarification because, yeah, outright, an AIO liquid cooler, especially a larger 360mm rad for example, is likely more performance than even a high-end air cooler. But that isn't necessarily what I mean by better. The biggest advantage air coolers have over AIOs is their lifespan. A good air cooler will never fail or degrade. Maybe the fan breaks a decade or two into use, but just throw a new fan on and you're golden, and even when it's broken it will still just about work fine. By comparison, AIOs will all fail. Maybe it's in 2 years, maybe it's in 10, but it will fail. They have improved a fair bit too. I've actually only had a couple of AIOs fail on me over, well, the decade or so of building PCs, But if you want to build your PC and not touch it again, at least the CPU anyway, coming back to the last point, an air cooler is your best bet. They're often pretty cheap too. The Arctic Freezer 36 is the latest version of my favourite air cooler, and that is under £20. That will happily cool any mid-range CPU, like a 9600X or an i5, and means that compared to the 60, 70, £80 you might spend on a 240mm AIO, you've got more cash in your pocket for more storage or even a higher end CPU. I will concede though that AIOs tend to be easier to mount, as there's less in the way of the socket itself and the weight is screwed to the case, not to the motherboard. And there isn't that hefty lamp actually resting on the motherboard itself. With that said, air coolers tend to be an install out of the case type of deal, and then they just become one with the motherboard. So when you come to replace the board with something newer, well, you just take the cooler out with it. Next, let's be real. You won't actually overclock your CPU, so don't waste your money on a high-end motherboard. Realistically, the number of PC gamers who actually overclock their CPU is so marginal that the odds are that you, the person watching this video right now, won't ever overclock your CPU. Even among the more enthusiast crowd who actually build their own systems, the number of genuine overclockers, especially in today's max boost era, is a tiny fraction of people. The point is, motherboard vendors like to upsell you on more expensive motherboards that feature, frankly, insane power delivery circuits to be able to support crazy overclocks that, especially with the current crop of chips, just isn't feasible without liquid nitrogen. So you sure as hell don't need it for your standard gaming system with an AIO or an air cooler. With Intel boards in particular, they market their Z series chipsets as the one for gamers, when really a B or H series chipset is more than enough for basically everyone. Here's an example. Asus will sell you a Z790 Tough board for £210, but they will sell you a remarkably similar B760 board for just £145, at least right now. Both have Wi-Fi, both have more than one M.2 slot, both have 4 RAM DIMMs, and they even have awfully similar rear I/O. Why waste £65 essentially on just overclocking supports when that's money that you can put into a higher end graphics card, more storage, more RAM, a better CPU, or even just save it outright? And last but not least, you don't need to upgrade. This is mostly aimed at those of you who are like feral cats chasing the next thing. If you've got an aging system that can't play the games that you want to play at the settings you're comfortable playing at, maybe you've just upgraded to a 1440p monitor and your GTX 1060 isn't doing it for you, then yeah, of course, you should upgrade. But if you have a 3080 and an 11900K and are gaming at 1440p with no problems, you're essentially wasting your money by upgrading. Now, of course, it's your money to waste, and who am I to judge you if you get some genuine enjoyment out of that sort of addictive hunt for the best, latest, top shelf stuff, and knowing that you always have the best thing. But I know that at least some of you haven't even stopped to consider if chasing the rabbit down the PC parts hole is actually what you want, or if you're just stuck in blind consumerism. If you aren't actively having issues with the games that you want to play at comfortable settings, you don't actually need to upgrade just because there is a newer, better thing available. You can stop and smell the roses, as it were. Of course, that's kind of funny advice from a channel whose technical objective is to help sell you stuff, but hey, at least you know that my objectives are a bit more moralistic and pure than pure consumerism. Either way, those are my favourite PC building hot takes. I'm sure you disagree with at least some of them, so let me know what you think in the comments down below. And like I said, let me know your favourite PC building hot takes in the comments while you're at it. If you do happen to want to buy some of the things that I mentioned, like a nice air cooler or maybe a Gen 3 SSD, I will leave some links in the description if you want to check them out. And yeah, If you want to check out my own hardware, the open source latency testing tool and open source response time tool, that's linked in the description as well, osrtt.com. You can also check out plenty of other links in the description, subscribe if you want to. There's plenty of other videos on the channel. I've been making videos for, what, 12 years now, so there's a few. And yeah, otherwise thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you all in the next video.